Welcome back to the channel. This is episode number 2 of a 5-part series I'm doing on a guide to better health with your smartphone. In episode number 1, we looked at the settings on your smartphone. So today we're going to look at peripherals. These peripherals include smartwatches and rings. These information gather data, usually cardiac data, and send the information back to your smartphone. Today I'm going to give a bit of a deeper dive in that and give you my perspective as a physician. Now this is a little different from reporters who usually talk about this, and when they come to things like ECG, they say, oh, that's so important, it does an ECG. But they don't really understand why that's important. So I'm going to give a bit of a different perspective today. I'm also going to tell you what smartwatch my wife and I wear, and this might surprise you. Stay tuned, this should be a lot of fun today, and I'm going to give you some good advice. I'm Ron Brown with Tech for Senior, where we help seniors understand technology and help them manage their health, particularly in getting knowledge about specific devices such as smartphones and peripheral devices like watches and rings. Remember, this is the second in a 5-part series I'm doing, and this is episode number 2. Now, there are many benefits to wearing peripheral devices such as watches and rings, and we're going to go through a lot of them in this series. But in this video, I'm going to tell you that everybody over the age of 60 should be wearing a smartwatch for 2 specific reasons. And we're going to talk about those 2 reasons and what my advice is and which watches you should be wearing. So the first graph I'm going to show you is the incidence of pacemaker insertion over the age of 60. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. So the graph on the screen is the incidence of pacemaker insertion based on age. And if you look, you'll see that after the age of 60, the incidence goes up not linearly, it goes up exponentially. So by the time you get to 70, lots of your friends are going to have pacemakers. And by the time you get to be 80, you're going to have lots of friends with pacemakers. So it goes up exponentially. Now, why is this so important? Well, let me give you 2 examples. 2 years ago, a lady in the town that I live in, Comox, British Columbia, was driving along and she was going to fill up gas at a convenience store. She had a medical event, passed out, drove through the pumps into the store. This caused a huge fire and burnt down the mini mall that she was in. The problem was there was a 300-pound propane tank attached to this because they sold propane. And there were 300 residents in a newly built apartment complex just next door. This could have turned out to be a total disaster. Fortunately, the firemen got the fire out quickly and they rescued the lady as well. So other than big disaster, there was no loss of life. Let me tell you about my second personal experience. A good friend of mine, a dentist from Nebraska, I've known for 30 years, had some symptoms. He was up on some scaffolding on his house. He passed out, fell off the scaffolding, broke a number of bones, and had a severe head injury. Today, after 1.5 years of therapy, he still has a significant brain injury, needs care, and will not be driving anymore. Had he had his pacemaker put in prior to the accident, none of this would have happened. So in your communities, you'll hear stories about medical events happening. A senior lost control of the car, went across a couple of lanes, maybe smashed into a restaurant, killing a young family of 5. These are very common reported accidents. And these are all because when your heart rate goes down to a very slow rate, the blood doesn't flow to your brain. And this causes you to pass out. And if you're driving a car, this could be disastrous. So we definitely need to know when your heart rate is too slow. So the first tip I'm going to give you when we're looking at purchasing a smartwatch to monitor our pulse, because we want to figure out if our pulse is too slow, we want to pick a watch. And most of them do this, no matter how cheap the watch is. They do a good job of measuring your pulse. But what you want to be able to do is to be notified if your pulse is too slow or too fast. Now, in the case of a pacemaker, it's going to be too slow. So you'll want to be able to control what the setting is on the slow side so it will notify you. So when you get your watch, I want you to set it up, and I want you to set the minimum heart rate before you get notified would be 60. And if your heart rate goes lower than 60, you need to talk to your healthcare provider. Now, a lot of blood pressure medicines you take do slow your heart rate down. And so that may not be abnormal. So your caregiver may decide that you should go from 60 maybe to 55 or maybe even down to 50 before you get notified. But if your heart rate goes lower than 50, then you need a thorough investigation just to make absolutely sure that you are not moving into that dangerous area where your heart is slowing down enough, you're going to lose circulation to your brain and require a pacemaker. And remember, this goes up exponentially. The incidence of this is very, very common. So if you get to be 70 years old, it is very, very high probability that sometime you may need a pacemaker. All right, so the second reason why it is so important that you have a smartwatch is to pick up if your heart rate is going too fast. Yes, too fast. And that could be a condition called atrial fibrillation. And this is where your heart rate speeds up. Now, again, as you look at the incidence on this graph, it's almost exactly the same graph. It goes up exponentially after the age of 60. Now, the problem with atrial fibrillation are twofold. The first, of course, is that there's a 5 times incidence of stroke. So if you have this condition, there's a 5 times increased incidence that you may have a stroke. And this is really a bad thing. I mean, if you have a stroke, you may not be able to drive again. You may not be able to live in your house anymore. You may need extended care. There's all sorts of things you don't want. You don't want to get a stroke. So the other problem with atrial fibrillation is over half the people that have atrial fibrillation don't know they have it. So it's hard to diagnose because if you don't have any symptoms, how are you going to know that you have atrial fibrillation until you end up in the hospital with a stroke? So if we had a way of helping those folks and identifying people that have atrial fibrillation, and it's common because if you saw that exponential graph, if we could help those, if we could find those people, identify them and get them help, then this would be a big improvement in people's well-being. So remember that watch that set the minimum heartbeat. We're looking for slow heartbeats for your pacemaker. Now we want to look at fast heartbeats. So you're going to take that same watch that you've bought because it will let you now set a maximum heartbeat to be notified. And I'm going to tell you to set it at 130 beats per minute. And if your heart rate goes over that, then you're going to see your healthcare provider. Talk it over with your healthcare provider. They may want to do some testing on that. And if it's okay, then we could increase it to maybe 140. But anything over 140, then you need to get that checked out for sure to make sure it's not atrial fibrillation. So we have 2 conditions now that you can just by getting a simple smartwatch that measures your pulse. It's very easy for these devices to measure your pulse, and you want to set it to a minimum and maximum heartbeat, and you're going to pick up the 2 deadliest and most important reasons for wearing a smartwatch. So wouldn't it be great if when your heart rate sped up and it was over 130 and you were concerned and wondering, do I have atrial fibrillation? If we could actually do an ECG or EKG, they're the same test, and it would identify it right there. And this came out about 10 years ago on the Apple Watch was the first to have this. And this is now the ability on smartwatches, certain smartwatches that are approved by the FDA, to do an ECG. It will actually do an ECG on your wrist, and it will tell you if you are or are not in atrial fibrillation. This was a big step forward in health with smartwatches. But it even got better. So let's think a little bit more about this. Now, I've already told you that half the people that have atrial fibrillation don't know they have it. So how are you going to help those folks? Well, you'd have to sort of monitor it on your pulse on a continual basis, right? To try and figure this out, because if you don't have any symptoms, how would you know when to push the button to do an ECG on your watch? So the next breakthrough occurred about 5 years later, and these devices with the improving sensors were able to do periodic testing on your heartbeat through the day. Now, it's not continuous, but they would monitor it periodically and try and pick up periods of atrial fibrillation. Now, one of the problems with the sensors we had 5 years ago, of course, were they weren't as good as we have now, and we really required you to be resting when they were trying to monitor this as you went around with your daily activity. So it would pick it up periodically through the day and mostly at night. And that's one of the really critical things about watches, is that you need to wear these devices at night, because a lot of the monitoring occurs at night because you're resting. When you're up walking around and moving, it's harder for these sensors to diagnose atrial fibrillation. And that came out about 5 years ago. And again, the Samsung, the Apple, the Google Fitbit, and Pixel watches all have been approved by the FDA to do this periodic monitoring, and it will notify you if there's any periods of atrial fibrillation. Okay, so let's go to fast forward where we are today. And there is one watch that leads the pack because the sensors are so good. This is a watch that actually has sensors that will actually monitor you on a continual basis. Yes, so it's continuous monitoring and will pick up any atrial fibrillation. The other thing is, I often get asked about, if you have atrial fibrillation, is there any advantage in wearing a smartwatch? In all the watches, when you go to enroll into the app, it says, do you have atrial fibrillation? And if you say yes, it won't allow you to use that feature on the watch. But with this one watch, it does. And you then gives you the option, if you do have atrial fibrillation, it's going to measure how long your heart is in atrial fibrillation, what were the aggravating and relieving factors, how long were you in atrial fibrillation, and it's going to document that and send that information to your healthcare provider. Oh my gosh, if I had that when I was practicing, it would have made my life so much easier. And this watch is really the one that stands out way ahead of the pack. And that, folks, is of course the Apple Watch. All right, let's talk about rings. But remember, we're focusing on the over 60 age group, and we're looking for two medical conditions. One is, remember, a slow heartbeat that is going to require a pacemaker, and a fast heartbeat, which may be atrial fibrillation. And how do the rings compare, and would I recommend them? Now, the two rings that we have on the market today are, of course, the Oura ring, which has been around for a number of years. You wear it on your finger. It measures certain health parameters and sends that information back to the app on your smartphone. We also have the newly released this past year, the Samsung Ring, which does pretty much the same thing by gathering information off your finger and sending the information back to the app on your phone. Now, based on what I've said earlier this presentation, I would not recommend that you purchase either of these two devices for the information we've just discussed. Let me talk about first the Oura Ring, which has been around the longest. The Oura Ring measures your heartbeat but it mostly does that at night and gives you an average. This is really not helpful in trying to diagnose those conditions because we need real-time monitoring and notification. It's a complete waste of time, and I would not recommend at all the Oura Ring for the health benefits that we've discussed in this video. And the second one is the Samsung Ring. Now, this is an interesting ring because, of course, it does do the minimum and maximum heart rate notification. Exactly that what I asked you for in the first part of this video. So why am I not recommending the Samsung Ring? Well, because of the cost. The cost is $100 more than the Samsung Watch. And the Samsung Watch is an excellent product. It not only does it measure your maximum minimum heart rate, it also will do your blood pressure, and it will also do the atrial fibrillation detection. It does a whole bunch more for a lot less money. So I cannot recommend the Samsung Ring. Now, the other important thing that you must understand is that when we're talking about Samsung and we're talking about the health app, is the health app only works with a Samsung phone. But the health app does not work with all Samsung phones. So before you go and invest in either a Samsung Ring or a Samsung Watch, you better make sure that you have a Samsung phone and that the health app works on that to communicate. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get the health monitoring features on those devices. In summary, I don't think the rings are a good option for someone over age of 60 looking for the cardiac issues that we've talked about today. So the last little bonus tip for you is I often get asked, is there any benefit in wearing a smartwatch if you have a cardiac pacemaker? And the answer to that question is no. And the reason is, of course, is because your cardiac pacemaker will be set to a minimum amount and your heart rate isn't going to go below that. So there's no reason to be monitoring that with a smartwatch. The other issue is with atrial fibrillation, and most pacemakers now will be in constant communication through wireless technology with your cardiologist. And if you have any bouts of atrial fibrillation, they will know and contact you. Also, when you go in to have your pacemaker checked at 6 months, they check the battery every 6 months. They'll be able to download the software, which will have scanned your heart for all those beats and make sure that there's no evidence of atrial fibrillation. So you're covered in both ways for that. And there really is no point from a cardiac point of view of wearing a smartwatch if you have a pacemaker. You're all wondering, what watch do I wear with my wife? Well, I clearly want the cardiac benefit. I want to be able to pick up those two things I discussed today. So I want a watch that gives me the maximum minimum heartbeat, is going to pick up atrial fibrillation and all the things we talked about today. But I don't have an iPhone. If I had an iPhone, I would have an Apple Watch. And in trying to figure out what my choice is, I also considered the cost because these watches are expensive. And the clear winner here was the Fitbit Charge 6. Now, the Fitbit Charge 6 has all the advanced cardiac monitoring that the Pixel watch has. So they're exactly the same, and it has all those features on it, but it's a lot cheaper. In fact, in the United States, the watch sells roughly for around $160 regular, but it's on sale all the time for about $99. In Canada, it sells for around $210, and it's on for about I think it's on sale now at Costco for $169. And these watches have this is the Charge 6, have all the advanced cardiac monitoring that the Pixel watch does. So it's called the Fitbit Charge 6, and that's what I wear, and that's what my wife wears. So hopefully that's been helpful for you today. Be sure and click that like and subscribe because we have 3 more videos coming out. We're going to talk about all sorts of health related things pertaining to your smartphone. It's Ron Brown with Tech for Senior. Hopefully you had fun today, and we'll see you soon.